So, the first story takes place back in 1801. There's this reef off the coast of Wales, right? And ships were constantly hitting it, sinking left and right. So, naturally, someone decided to build a lighthouse there. Now, this lighthouse was pretty unique and kinda isolated, built on the reef by drilling holes and using oak beams to support the structure. It had two floors. The bottom was where the keepers lived, like their bedroom and living space, and the top floor was where they kept the light going, basically their workspace. Imagine how lonely that must have been. The job of these lighthouse keepers? Pretty simple, but boring. They just had to light the beacon every night. No big deal, right? Except they were stuck there for 4 to 6 months at a time before anyone came to relieve them and let them go back to the mainland for a break. At the time, most lighthouses were run by private companies, and on this particular one, they sent two guys named Thomas. One older, one younger. Not related, just happened to have the same name. They got stationed at this tiny lighthouse called Small's Lighthouse for 4 months of work. Now, from the outside, things seemed to be going smoothly. The light was always on, everything seemed fine. But there was one weird thing. Sometimes sailors would see this figure up on the lighthouse, waving at them through the fog. It wasn't super creepy at first, just this guy waving, and the sailors would wave back like, "Hey there! Nice to see you too!" Totally chill. But here's where it gets spooky. A few months later, an old sea captain, who used to be in the Royal Navy, suddenly realized something. He was like, "Wait a minute, how were we seeing someone waving from the lighthouse?" The fog was thick, and besides, the lighthouse structure didn't even allow anyone to stand outside and wave like that. So, he brought it up with his crew, and they all agreed something was definitely off. They decided to check it out. So, this brave bunch of sailors carefully navigated their way to the lighthouse, avoiding the reefs. And when they got there, they started climbing up. And just as they were about to go inside, they looked up. And there was the waving man. Except it wasn't a man at all. It was a dead body, swinging in the wind. Creepy, right? It wasn't really waving. It was just swaying back and forth. Shocked, they climbed up and entered the lighthouse, only to find the inside covered in weird symbols and eerie drawings. There was no one there, except for the dead guy hanging outside. But the light had been running like clockwork for months. So, who was keeping the light going? The sailors rushed back to tell the captain what they'd seen. And the captain, staying super calm, said, "Don't panic. Every lighthouse must have two keepers. There's still one more person in there." So, the captain and his crew went back up and thoroughly searched the place. And in the living quarters, they heard a noise. A faint sound coming from under one of the beds. They looked, and sure enough, there was the older Thomas, huddled up, hair turned white, looking absolutely terrified and gaunt. He was in such bad shape, barely hanging on. The captain calmed him down, reassured him they were there to help, and finally, old Thomas started telling his story. Turns out, he and the younger Thomas didn't get along from the start. They argued a lot and had some bad blood between them, which only made things worse when they were stuck together for 4 months. One day, while lighting the beacon, younger Thomas slipped and hit his head hard. Old Thomas tried to help, but the injury was serious, and after a few days, younger Thomas passed away. Now, with no way to send word to the mainland and no wireless radios back then, old Thomas was stuck. He didn't know what to do, so he kept the body inside the living quarters for a while. Imagine how terrifying that would have been. Eating, sleeping, living with your dead colleague right there. Eventually, the mental strain got too much, so he built a makeshift coffin from their supplies, put younger Thomas inside, and tied the coffin outside, thinking that was better. When asked why he didn't just give him a sea burial, old Thomas explained that people knew they didn't get along. If younger Thomas's body disappeared, everyone would think he had killed him. He needed the body to prove his innocence. It was a desperate but rational move on his part. But here's where it gets even worse. During a storm, the coffin got ripped loose, and younger Thomas's body, still tied to a rope, started banging against the lighthouse, like it was knocking at the door. That sound drove old Thomas to the edge of madness. In the dark, in the fog, with no one around, he started hearing things, seeing things, and imagining his dead colleague was still haunting him. Every day he lit the beacon, just waiting, hoping for rescue before he completely lost his mind. Thankfully, the crew showed up just in time to save him before he lost his sanity completely. He'd been trying to signal for help, but no one came, until they finally did. So, yeah, that's the story. A spooky, isolated lighthouse, a terrible accident, and one man's descent into madness. Creepy, right? So, back in 1801, right? Britain was already on the edge of that whole Victorian era, all about enlightenment and stuff. People were starting to pay more attention to survivors, especially those working at sea. They figured, hey, we gotta change things up for these folks. Their working conditions are brutal, and they deserve better pay, better environments. Especially the lighthouse keepers. Their job was insanely tough. So, naturally, people started thinking about improving their lives. It kicked off with the scientists, of course. They took a hard look at that whole tragic lighthouse situation and thought, what if we could make the lights brighter? What if the beam could rotate, send signals, and maybe prevent this kind of disaster? That's when this young British scientist, Fresnel, steps in. He's the genius behind the idea of making the light not just reflect forward, but to do it more efficiently. Before, light scattered all over the place, but Fresnel figured, why not add a lens to focus the light better? But here's the thing. The lens was huge and heavy, totally impractical for those small lighthouses. So what does Fresnel do? He carves out part of the lens, notices that as long as the light refracts twice, it still shoots straight ahead. Eventually, he flattens it out, adds some grooves, and boom! We've got the Fresnel lens. It's still used today in cameras and all sorts of stuff. Now, instead of light scattering everywhere, it's focused, and lighthouses can send signals far and wide. Then someone had this brilliant idea. Why don't we make the lighthouse light rotate? That way, it can send flashes, like a signal. But how do you make it spin without wasting tons of energy? Easy. Suspend it with a rope so it can rotate, and float the whole thing on mercury. A super heavy liquid that lets the thing glide smoothly. Now the whole setup is not only energy efficient, but foolproof, right? Wrong. Now come the social scientists. They realize 2 people alone on a lighthouse can go stir-crazy. You need a third person to keep things balanced, prevent misunderstandings, and keep everyone sane. So, they decided, from now on, 3 people minimum. Great. With Fresnel's lens and 3-person crews, lighthouses are solid, right? Nope. Things were still spooky. Fast forward 100 years to 1900, and things get even weirder. This time, we're in Scotland, on a small, cozy island with a much better lighthouse. 3 guys are on a 2-week shift. Easy peasy, right? It's just like a mini vacation. But then, from the outside looking in, something super strange happens. It's December 15th, just 10 days before Christmas. The people monitoring the lighthouse from afar notice, hey, the light's not on. What's going on? So they notify the lighthouse board. The board's all like, hey, it's close to their shift change. Maybe they're just tired. We'll send a team on the 20th to check it out. They assume it's just a mistake. But then, a massive storm hits, delaying the crew until December 26th, the day after Christmas. When the relief crew finally gets to the island, things get really bizarre. Usually, the lighthouse keepers are stoked to see people after being isolated for so long. But this time, crickets. No one comes out to greet them. They send someone up to check it out, and right off the bat, they notice the flagpole doesn't have a flag. A total break from protocol. The lighthouse door is open, and inside, everything's neatly arranged. Blankets folded, dishes cleaned. Everything looks normal. Except there's no sign of the three men. Two of the raincoats are missing, but one is still hanging. Creepy, right? The guy checking it out rushes back to the boat, freaked out, and reports that the three men are just gone. More people head up to search, and things only get weirder. Some say they felt a strange pressure in their ears, like an eerie wind, and the atmosphere inside the lighthouse was thick, almost suffocating. People start whispering about how the island has a dark history. See, years ago there was a church built on the island, but the locals never really bought into Christianity. They were more into their old, pagan rituals. They'd even do these bizarre ceremonies around Christmas, supposedly summoning spirits from the sea, like ancient warrior ghosts. It sounds wild, but that's what the locals believed. So naturally, the Scottish sailors who were there totally freaked out and blamed it all on these ancient spirits, thinking the island was cursed. But the lighthouse company, being all scientific and modern, wasn't having any of that. They needed real answers. By December 29th, they send a third team to investigate. They comb through everything and conclude the men had dinner, then vanished into thin air. There's no sign of a struggle, and the diary they left behind has a few strange entries. On December 12th, one guy wrote about an unimaginable storm that was unlike anything he'd seen in 20 years. The next day, the storm continued, and the men began praying for divine help. Then, nothing. The last entry, on December 15th, just said, "The storm is over. God is with us." And that's it. End of the log. Word spread fast, and the locals were convinced that the ancient spirits, called the Fae, had claimed the men. The legend took off like wildfire, with some people even suggesting aliens were involved, or that the three men had been swept out to sea by a freak wave. The most rational theory: mercury poisoning. The lighthouse floated on a bed of mercury, and long-term exposure could drive people mad. Some thought one guy might have snapped, killed the other two, and then thrown himself into the sea. But in 2014, a journalist dug into the case again and found new evidence. Before the storm, someone had checked on the men, and everything seemed fine. They were all getting along. No signs of mercury poisoning or madness. In 2017, another investigator found out that the spooky diary entries, they were fake, probably made up to add drama to the story. The most likely explanation is simple. Two men went out to secure equipment during the storm. The third guy, worried about getting in trouble, rushed out without proper gear, and a massive wave took them all. But hey, that's just one theory. This lighthouse mystery is still unsolved, and people keep coming up with new ideas, even today. Thanks for your watching. Let's see you next video.